I feel greatly honored to welcome Admiral Blair as a new chairman of the SPFUSA Peace Foundation USA. And we have Susan Glasser. She's moderating the session for Admiral Blair. So please come up to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chano-san, and thanks to all of you for coming on this rainy day to discuss this important, or to hear about and think about this important topic. I have a great number of friends of long standing out in the audience, and I want to reassure all of them that I don't think I've become any smarter by this new job than I was when we worked together and they set me straight on many things in those years. But I have gained some more experience, a few more successes, a few more mistakes, and I have a pretty big Rolodex now of people who know about and care about Asia. And my real ambition for SPFUSA Peace Foundation USA is to reinforce that strong U.S.-Japan relationship by calling on all of you all who care about and know about the relationship, and I believe as I do, that a strong relationship is a cornerstone of not only American strategy in East Asia, but also a cornerstone for a better future for everybody in that region, no matter what country they live in. Now, my assignment is my usual ex-military knuckle-dragging assignment of talking about the military realities underneath the issues that we've been talking about. And I must say that it's relatively straightforward to describe the desired operational outcomes that the United States would like to see of Japan's current sequence of changes that it's been making to its defense policies and to its forces. As we've heard from some of the previous speakers, this began with the upgrading of the Japan Defense Agency to a ministry in 2007, proceeded through the establishment of a National Security Council, the enactment of a state secrets law, the development of a national security strategy, and now consideration of Japan's potential participation in collective self-defense. And Prime Minister Abe and those who he works with have followed a pretty steady course to what I think is a pretty simple goal, which is Japan directing, controlling, employing its armed forces through government policy. Now, this is the practice of all of the rest of the world's democracies, but in the past, the operational employment of Japan's armed forces have taken place through a unique and awkward process of individual constitutional rulings on tactical components of overall missions. And in practice, these procedures have sharply limited an effective contribution by Japan's forces both to common missions with the United States under our shared objectives in the alliance and to the wider global multilateral UN peacekeeping operations that peace-loving countries undertake. So from the American point of view, what we would like to do would be able to operate with the Japan self-defense forces in the way, say, we operate with NATO forces. American and Japanese maritime and air forces in particular have interoperable communication systems, common procedures, many of the same weapon systems, and ideally, Japanese aircraft, ships, missile batteries should be able to form into combined task forces with US aircraft, ships, and missile batteries, and those of other countries to deal with common threats as decided by the policies of both their governments. Both the US and the Japanese ships and aircraft that are in these combined task forces should have the same rules for self-defense, common ability to designate hostile forces, common rules of engagement, and the ability to operate in mutual support. Those are all the characteristics of an effective combined military task force. Now, the contingencies are the scenarios in which this sort of combined US-Japan task force would operate are very important to the interests of both countries, and they're not that far-fetched. But before discussing them, I do need to emphasize that I'm not predicting that these contingencies would actually occur. I'm describing the military realities that underlie the situation should a crisis occur, as it has many times in the past. And the better the United States and Japan understand these realities, and in fact, the better all of the countries in the region understand these realities, then the less likely it is that any of these will happen, because none of us wants them to. Improved Japanese-American cooperation under collective self-defense would make aggression more likely. In fact, more robust cooperation would enhance deterrence. I should also add that it's been 10 years since I was involved in the actual American and Japanese plans for these contingencies, so I'm out of date. I'm also an outsider, which has its pluses and its minuses, but I am somebody who's been watching these issues and with some military experience in the region, so I think I've got it pretty close to right. First, let's start with dealing with North Korean missile intimidation, something that's happened in the past, as we heard from Ambassador Beasley, is one of the most striking and dangerous trends in the future. Japanese and U.S. ballistic missile defense cruisers and destroyers should be part of a combined task group that includes U.S. satellite systems, sensors and communications, U.S. and Japanese shore-based radars, as well as Japanese and U.S. Patriot missile batteries in the region. South Korean systems should also be included in this defensive network, and this network should be employed and operated so that it defends the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United States. But without an ability to exercise its right of collective self-defense, Japanese radars and missile systems may be employed only to protect Japan, thus precluding Tokyo from contributing to an overall regional air defense network. A regional network that has to take into account these sort of restrictions is not only very operationally difficult to control and provides a much less effective defense, but more important, it provides North Korea with many opportunities to play Japan, South Korea, and the United States against one another, to look for wedges among those countries, all of whom are threatened by North Korean missiles. And it really increases the likelihood of North Korea thinking that its provocations could be successful. Now, moving to major North Korean aggression against the Republic of Korea, Japanese contributions to defeating an attack again would be vital. It's very much in Japan's national interest that North Korea be defeated quickly and decisively. As in the First Korean War, Japan would be a transportation and logistics rear base for American reinforcements to the Combined Forces Command Korea. Now, however, many U.S. bases in Japan would be ranged by North Korean missiles, which was not true the last time around. The United States would expect Japan to be able to defend these bases as part of the regional air and missile defense network that I talked about. In addition, there would be a huge air and sea bridge from Japan to South Korea, and Japan would be expected to defend the Japan terminus of that bridge against air attacks, submarine attacks, minings. To meet these expectations, to conduct the missions that would bring the conflict to an end more quickly, the Japanese self-defense force must be able to engage in collective self-defense. Turning to military contingencies in the East China Sea, Japan has stated that it will remove any foreign forces that land on the Senkakus. They've made it quite clear. And Japan expects the United States to support such a recapture operation. In a dynamic military operation of this nature, there would be instances in which American ships and aircraft would engage hostile forces threatening Japanese ships and aircraft, and instances in which Japanese ships and aircraft would engage hostile forces that threatened American ships and aircraft. It's much more dangerous to the ships and aircraft of both countries if Japanese ships and aircraft are permitted only to protect themselves, and it makes a much less effective combined task force. In a Taiwan scenario, many of the considerations would be similar to those that I briefly outlined for a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. American forces helping Taiwan defend itself against unprovoked aggression would be operating from US and Japanese bases in Japan. Japan would be expected to defend their end of defend those bases against missile attacks. There again would be a sea and air bridge, and Japanese air and Navy forces would be expected to help protect the Japanese end of that bridge against air, submarine, and missile attacks. For the Japanese self-defense forces to be able to carry out those missions, they need the authority to engage in collective self-defense. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about the likelihood of any of these things, which I consider to be extremely low. I'm talking about making that likelihood even lower by ensuring that the military reality that takes place when crisis occurs tends to default to a more peaceful set of options, not one that is unbalanced and dangerous, so that any side is tempted by making military moves. Now, in the past, the capabilities of potential regional aggressors were relatively weak. The United States and Japan could achieve their common objectives without their forces operating together in the integrated fashion that I described. Current trends and future projections, however, are not positive, and unless collective self-defense can be realized, it will take much higher levels of force on both the American and the Japanese sides to keep that same level of operational risk from increasing and getting out of control and becoming more of a risk than a reassurance of stability. The prohibition on collective self-defense also limits Japanese participation in international peacekeeping operations. We've heard several of our previous speakers refer to some instances of Japan's participation, which has been good, but not what it could be. Japan currently sends civil affairs units, medical, construction, election monitors, but not units that are capable of defending themselves. There are many UN operations around the world that are preventing widespread suffering and death. They need capable, disciplined blue helmets that can enforce the peace. And Japan, as a country that believes in and supports the UN mission, could make a contribution much more in proportion to its influence and to its resources. It should be able to deploy armed and effective units that can keep the peace in an assigned sector in a UN operation, and it needs to have the right of collective self-defense in order to play that role. The Japan self-defense forces have the platforms, the weapons, communications equipment, doctrine, trained personnel, all the things you need to perform these missions that I have discussed. What it does not have is a system that will provide clear political direction when a crisis occurs so that it can form a task force, implement planning that has taken place in the past, join a bilateral or multilateral task force as a full partner. The very capable officers of the Japan Self-Defense Force, and I know many of them, including my friend General Yamaguchi here, do not conduct military planning like their counterparts do in every other developed democratic country of the world that I know, receiving policy guidance from their government based on Japan's interests and its objectives, then proposing military courses of action to carry out that guidance, and then receiving decisions on which course of action is chosen, and then going off and operating. Rather, they currently must devise individual tactical missions that can be permitted under current constitutional interpretations. These tactical missions are then vetted within the government, subject to long delays that undermine their effectiveness, and the eventual decision often bears little relation to Japan's real interests in the issues that started the process in the first place. I would say that Japanese military deployments in recent years that have resulted from this process have an almost unblemished record of missing opportunities. And there were some charitable descriptions of what Japan has done recently that we heard, but I take a somewhat different view on it. I think Japan could have done much more, both to support its own interests and wider international interests. All these operations took place after strong internal government and often public debates within Japan, but the debates were centered not so much on whether these missions were in Japan's interest, whether they supported the sort of a world that Japan wanted to live in and be a part of, but on whether they conformed to an extant constitutional interpretation. And I think it deformed the nature of strategic thinking in Japan. In the mid-1980s, Japan did not protect its oil tankers from attacks by Iraq and Iran in the Persian Gulf. In the first Gulf War, Japan dispatched capable mine-sweeping units, but only after the war was over. In 1992, a Japanese contingent of engineers and policemen sent to Cambodia abandoned their posts due to safety concerns and retreated down to be evacuated. In 1999, Japan failed to join 22 other countries that contributed forces to the Australian-led peacekeeping operation in East Timor. In 2002, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force set up a refueling station in the Indian Ocean for American and other ships, but it was far from the location of the Afghan war that they were supporting and that the Japanese government was in favor of, and most of the Japanese people were. Now, of course, Japan must follow its constitution, so must every democratic country. And we Americans are far from the best example of a country that has updated our own 250-year-old document. We have, as we know, a Second Amendment based on the era of colonial militias that provides a tiny minority of Americans a rationale for opposing gun control measures that are favored and have been by an overwhelming majority of Americans for many, many years. However, for Japan, collective self-defense limitations are making it more and more difficult not only for it to play a role in the world commensurate with its influence and its interests, but also to take basic actions to defend its security in cooperation with its major ally, the United States. The security environment in which Japan finds itself and which it sees in the future is changing, and we who are friends of Japan should help it to play that positive role of which it is fully capable. And with this record of missed opportunities and the security environment that Japan sees itself moving into, it's no wonder that many Japanese leaders feel that it is past time for Japan's security procedures to be updated so that Japan can make its military deployment decisions like any other democracy, identify the national interests that are at stake, consult friends and allies, determine the role of military force in protecting Japanese interests, make sure that there's domestic support for what you're going to do, and then assign the appropriate missions and forces to the military commander. Prime Minister Abe has been the most active Japanese leader who thinks this way, and he has moved out to implement these ideas, both in his first administration and notably in his current time in office. And we will hear this afternoon from another Japanese leader, Shiba Shigeru, who is also a strong supporter of modernizing Japan's defense policies. But Americans should also understand that these leaders, although they are all staunch supporters of the US-Japan alliance, they also believe that this alliance should be more equal. Japan should play a much stronger role in making decisions and setting policies with the United States than was true in the past. And I don't think we've talked about that enough in this session so far this morning, that yes, Japan wants to improve its ability to cooperate with the United States, but I think more fundamentally, Japan wants to become a more mature partner in a more balanced relationship. And perhaps the days of the United States deciding here in Washington what we wanted to do and then going and selling our gallant allies, the Japanese, on what it is might come to an end, and it might have to be a much more dynamic and consultative formulation of policy. I think that would be a good thing overall, but it will make the jobs of people like Assistant Secretary Russell and Mark Lippert much more difficult in the future than it was for those in the past. Americans should also understand that there are others in Japan who feel very differently about their country's use of military force. And as Japan is wrestling with these important questions, Americans need to understand the other side of the public debate in Japan. Some of those opposing a more normal set of policies for Japan's use of military force are motivated by admirable, principled reasons. Others by narrow-minded and even selfish reasons. On the narrow-minded and selfish side, there are the free riders. They like the current unbalanced nature of the Japan-US treaty. They believe that Japan can rely on the United States to bear the overwhelming proportion of the burden of providing security around the world, and if the United States is willing to do that, Japan should allow it to continue. Also on the narrow-minded side are those who believe that the current very limited Japanese deployments of forces that have been talked about here may not have been very successful, but they didn't do much harm to Japanese interests, so why make many changes? If anything, Japanese military Deployments could be further reduced. On the principled side, there are the genuine pacifists in Japan. They believe that Japan has given up the right to use military force except for self-defense. They believe that their constitution reflects this decision, and they are opposed on principle to wider use by Japan of military force. Also on the principled side are those who point out that there's not been a single Japanese soldier, sailor, or airman killed in an overseas military operation since World War II, and they're proud of this record. They don't want to break it. It is these contending points of view that make this issue of engaging in collective self-defense so controversial in Japan. Polling results show variations depending on how you ask the question and when it was asked, but the numbers in favor of constitutional reinterpretation to permit these changes are about half. Support does seem to be somewhat higher among elected officials than it does among the public at large. So what can those of us who are friends of Japan and want Japan to play a stronger role to do? How can we be helpful? It's tempting just to root for strong action by Prime Minister Abe, hoping he'll use his political capital to force through the necessary changes. I mean, that's kind of the easy way out, right? But in order for a change as major as this to endure in a democratic Japanese political system, it must be done after robust debate and with a measure of support across the major parties in that country. If it's done as a partisan political action or seen to be done as a partisan political action, it risks being reversed if the government changes or being weakly supported in any case. So Americans should favor changes that garner broad-based support, even if they do not perhaps go the entire distance that we would like if we were writing Japan's constitution again, as we did decades ago. At the same time, friends of Japan should not hesitate in telling Japan that we support Japan taking more active responsibility for common security concerns. That is what Americans and American friends of Japan would like. That's what we prefer. The security environment has changed fundamentally since the Yoshida Doctrine was fashioned. It's appropriate for the US-Japan relationship to be much more balanced in both its objectives and in its burdens. From a military point of view, American and Japanese military forces need to continue realistic military planning for the various contingencies that we may face together in East Asia and around the world. This planning, whether it's by conference, war games, staff talks, it should illuminate the full range of combined operations that American and Japanese defense forces could face together. At the initial stage, this planning should not be constrained by the current limitations Japan imposes on itself in terms of collective self-defense. The final decisions should be made, of course, and will be made by Japan's elected government based on the Constitution, its interpretation at the time, Japan's law and policy, but only by providing a full set of military analysis with various courses of actions and the risks that are involved in them will Japan national security leaders understand the risks and the benefits of various degrees of collective self-defense. And finally, the United States should continue to make it clear to other countries in the region, South Korea and China especially, and around the world, that we very much favor Japan playing a bigger role in addressing common security challenges. We should actively oppose and discredit groundless accusations that the Japanese actions constitute a threat to peace and security, much less that Japanese militarism is somehow being reborn. Prime Minister Abe himself put it nicely last year when he said, even if we reactivated the right to have a collective self-defense or amended Article 9 of the Constitution, that would only put Japan in the same position as the other countries around the globe. We would still be, and I can't resist this part of the quote, we would still be in a more limited position than the Canadians. I'm sure the Prime Minister did not mean to offend our northern neighbors. But there's been no country in the world that has followed a more responsible, restrained, defensive security policy than Japan for the last 70 years. The Japan self-defense forces are under the strict political control of its democratic government. They will be employed responsibly under any changes to the Constitution or any changes to the interpretation of the Constitution. And we should support a Japan that can play a more active and responsible and peaceful and allied role in dealing with the security challenges that the United States and Japan will face in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
The President made a little bit of news on his trip with his surprising, even eyebrow-raising description of his view of what he's trying to do in American foreign policy right now, in a way that gets at this big picture question of American leadership in the world today. And the president described his current ambitions as being one of hitting singles, doubles, getting on the base, to use an American baseball metaphor. And I'm curious what you make of that and what it tells us about the role of American leadership in Asia, but also just more generally, globally right now.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Let me talk about Asia first. I think the remarkable thing about U.S. Strategy and policy in Asia has been its consistency over the last, well, let's see, ever since the last helicopter pulled off the roof of the embassy in Ho Chi Minh, what's now Ho Chi Minh City. I mean, once those post-colonial wars in Southeast Asia ended and the United States sort of readjusted from that, American policy has been just very, very steady. And it was interesting to see, for instance, Assistant Secretary Russell, Mark Lippert talking. They are motivated by just the same strategy in Asia that I was when I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, that many of you all here in the audience were when you served in embassies or in defense missions or units out there. So I think the thing about U.S. policy in Asia has been the incredible strategic consistency, which administrations have not changed, have in fact reinforced. So I think the president is kind of underselling the U.S. role in Asia by talking about singles and doubles. I think it is in fact a prolonged success story of being able to provide a security environment so that economic development of an unparalleled nature happened, and that democratic values have spread to country around the region. Some of them former U.S. allies, some of them not. So I think that's an undersell of what is done in Asia. And it was the president's last press conference after a long trip. So I'm sure he was looking forward to getting back and so on. But I would give much stronger marks to U.S. policy in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. I think you raised the question of the moment that we're at in terms of Asia and security policy. You talk about the incredible consistency of the American approach to the region over the last couple of decades. Are we facing a moment when a new approach is required? One question that people have had looking at a rising China that is spending a lot more money on its military, that is taking much more assertive positions around the region than it has in the past. And I guess one of the questions as people looked at the schedule and the itinerary of President Obama was whether American policy is going to shift along with that new reality of China.
We've heard previous panels talk pretty eloquently about this, and I basically share their views that China's development, much more economic power, now much more military power, has meant the United States has had to do a lot more to maintain the same sort of strategy. We saw the adjustment that Assistant Secretary Russell talked about, how there had been a period in which the United States had not been spending a whole lot of sort of leadership time and diplomatic activity in Asia. Our Secretary of State missed a couple of meetings of regional forums, and there was sort of a feeling that the United States wasn't tending to the strategy. But I think the things we're seeing now are sort of just doing the needful to maintain that same strategy in view of a non-status quo country. I mean, China did benefit from the system of peace and economic prosperity, just the way many other countries in the region did. But now that it's as big as it is, it's thinking, I should be part of this scene. I don't need to, have an American-dominated scene. And as we've heard from many people, the United States is willing to share some of this responsibility. I can tell you, I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command at the apogee of American hyperpower, and it never felt quite as uber power as I was reading people writing about. I mean, you have constraints, you've got things you have to do, and we'd like China to get into that role and assume some of the responsibilities of keeping the whole system going so that they can benefit more, all of us can benefit more. So I think that we have to raise our game to maintain the same strategy, to accommodate newly prosperous and more powerful countries like China. But I think the fundamental strategy of what we want, which is keep the use of military force off the table, in the background, a stable military system, rely on trade, increasing the wealth of all people in the region, and then supporting our values that we believe in government, as opposed to the type that the Chinese are advocating. That's the way we can do it.
Now, the word containment is a little bit of a dirty word, certainly in Beijing. I'm curious what your view is of whether, on some level, that is what the U.S. may have to do in the future in the region when we think about the possibility of a more militarily assertive China. Is that, call it what you will, but
right.
is that a realistic assessment of the possible scenario for U.S. power in the region?
There's only one country that can contain China, and that's China. Mm-hmm. If China acts in a way that shows that they believe that this sort of unfettered use of economic and military power can be used to advance interests in territorial disputes and trade relations and in the whole raft of things in which countries jostle up against each other, then the rest of the region and the United States, as the most powerful outside country in there, are going to band together. And we've seen little episodes of that along the way. And my reading of the Chinese is that they understand that too, and they are trying to figure out how they, which is a very normal and I think something that we should be in favor of. They're trying to see how they can advance their interests using the levers that they have available. That's fine. That's all. That's the way these things happen. So I do not. I have faith in the Chinese leaders that they won't be misguided enough to contain themselves. I know for sure that the rest of the countries in the region in the United States don't want to contain them. And I guess the third thing I say, keying off what Ambassador Beasley says, I'm old enough to remember containment, and this is no containment. This is not what we did with the Soviet Union. It's not even on the same page. So I think that's kind of an overblown.
Beware metaphors in foreign policy, right?
That's true. Beware of that too.
Let me ask you though about the American stomach for continuing to play this kind of a leadership role, especially in the face of what could be a rising set of threats. I think we're seeing that play out a bit in Europe on the other side of the world with this question of the crisis in Ukraine and, what exactly is America prepared to do about it, even if Russia marches in and hives off pieces of territory. First of all, do you think you could see a scenario like that playing out in Asia, say over the islands or some other flashpoint? And secondarily, how do you factor in this intangible sense that we certainly all have sitting here in Washington, that the American people, they don't really have the stomach to play quite the same kind of leadership role anymore?
Misunderestimating the American stomach in Asia has been a recipe for failure for most countries that have tried it. What the American people don't support are things that don't make sense to them. Let's just take some effort. But why is it? Why are we doing it? Why is this region important to us? So a lot of it has to do with leadership at the national level. Now that I'm not in government, I can spend much more time, which is very enjoyable, in other places in the country, talking to people who, don't live here, and the degree of American citizen involvement in the world in general, but Asia in particular, is huge. They fly over to countries in Asia all the time. They have friends who are Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority in the country and all. So I think Americans are still very much interested and care about and know about other parts of the world, including Asia. I think we just need to take advantage of that to make smart policies that explain what we're doing, that will take advantage of that to make the world a good place in Asia and a better place for the United States. So I think it's simply a case of harnessing that sentiment. I do think that Americans are tired of sending their sons and daughters off to die in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and not seeming to get a whole lot for it. And many of us who have friends and sons and daughters of friends who died there feel the same way. But I don't think that translates into undercutting overall American involvement in the world and determination to support that involvement.
Mm-hmm. As you travel internationally these days, do you encounter people who say to you, well, hey, what's happened to America, or encounter this perceived weakness or indifference to the world?
Yeah. I mean, some people, most people are pretty polite, and they won't say it quite that directly, but you can sort of sense that feeling there. So it's something that we have to work on. And in your business that one effect of this global media is that the phases of these things just go so quickly. It's hard to stand back, make your eyes squinty, and determine what are real trends. But my sense going around the world is that people have seen the United States act in very intelligent, clever ways. They've seen us act in somewhat stupid ways, and as they do an overall evaluation, they said, by and large, it's okay. I think the most canny observer is Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who wrote a book about his memoirs, and there's a chapter on the United States, and he said, it basically boils down to this, well, if you're going to have a country that's big and powerful and all around, the United States is probably better than most. And I think that's how most people feel, and so we have a lot of credibility, and if we play it right, we can make it a good world both for our citizens and for theirs.
Just quickly, because I want to make sure that we get to some questions from the audience. Everyone's been very patiently holding those back this morning, but I want to ask you a couple other quick questions. You mentioned the war in Afghanistan, and I'm curious what you see as a couple, 2 or 3 kind of long-term consequences from that. I'm recalling Hillary Clinton's original famous Pivot to Asia article that appeared in Foreign Policy when I was editing it. And her explicit rationale in that article, which often has gotten lost in the subsequent conversation about whether there really is a pivot to Asia and whether it's military or not, her explicit rationale there was the war in Afghanistan and Iraq is going to be ending, and rather than having a sort of America come home, tend to our own problems, foreign policy, we need to make sure that doesn't happen, and we need to look at sort of the big strategic challenges and turn our gaze more strategically to Asia. So that was actually the original rationale, as she stated it, behind the pivot to Asia. And I'm curious, is that realistic, A, at this point in time, and B, what are other potential long-term consequences from the war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm not a real believer in threat substitution. I remember when Colin Powell said at one point, I'm kind of running out of threats to do that. I think the explanation you heard from Assistant Secretary Russell was more my feeling on how it went, which was that when you look around the world at what areas are going to be important, where are American interests, and where are the challenges, East Asia is a place we ought to be paying attention to, and that the crises and wars of the moment, understandably, and I think Secretary Gates' book is probably the one that sort of reminds us when you're Secretary of Defense and you've got 130,000 people in combat, that's your day, that's your focus, and so I think it was a good collective government decision to try to align more our overall efforts in alignment with where we saw the security environment was and where we saw our interests were. And I think that's a stronger rationale than, oh, we have to find some place to use them since they're not going to be involved in Afghanistan, to really oversimplify what you said.
Mm-hmm. So clearly you're liberated by being out of government. I was struck by your comment about Japan in the last few years and its unblemished record of missing opportunities when it comes to certain strategic challenges. And I'm curious if you could turn your gaze to U.S. Security policy in the last few years. It seems only fair if we're going to ding Japan. What's your view of, have there been any missed opportunities in the last few years that you see as potentially having long-term consequences?
When I was in government, I was struck by the contrast between Asia, East Asia, where I thought we had a pretty good sense of what the big moving parts are and had a good American strategy that all of us, whether we were military, diplomatic, or economic, could follow, and our policy in the Middle East, which struck me as was all over the map. It was sort of fractionated in terms of the issues: counterproliferation, terrorism, Iran, Pakistan. It was fractionated with the factions within the United States that cared about different parts of it, and it was sort of out of line with our values. It put us into dealing with countries that, did things that we didn't like, and I think, I think we've missed an opportunity which we should have worked harder on instead of thinking we're just getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq and therefore let's do something else, to really get a handle on an overall Middle East policy that better incorporates our interests, our values, our allies, and our objectives there than we had. So I'd say that's the biggest area that still needs work.
You're always safe, right, on some level to predict that, at least for the last 60 years, right? It seems the news this week would suggest that peace in our time is not at hand. So
certainly not that part of the world. Yeah.
Should we get some questions from the audience? I know this is a patient group.
Yeah.
We have microphones here, and I'm hoping that you'll identify yourself, and please do make it a question so that we can get to as many people as possible. We have someone here in the front, and then we'll take you. They're going to bring you a microphone.
Thank you. I'm interested in the issue that you mentioned about Russian take over Crimea. Now let's turn to Taiwan. I believe Taiwan is also part of the Japan and United States security interest. With the current trend, a large amount of Chinese immigrants into Taiwan, it's a matter of time that China can do the same trick to Taiwan as the Russians do to Crimea, where the Americans stay put or will simply walk away.
And what's your organization, sir?
Oh, I'm part of the Taiwan government, USA.
I see. Well, what do you think? That's your country's problem, right? You all have to.
Will
you
you
all
stay,
have to take.
or you are going to walk away?
I don't know. No, we're not going to walk away. I mean, I was in Taiwan last week, in fact, and saw those now hundreds of thousands of mainlanders who are visiting Taiwan, and it's huge. It's transformative. But I think that the future of Taiwan has been, an example that American policy has said, this is not going to happen by force, but it is going to develop in some fashion. At some point, Taiwan and China have to figure it out, and I think that's still a very valid strategy. I don't see a sneak attack by the PLA designed as Chinese tourists who are in the Palace Museum and all of a sudden pull out their AK-47s, and it just doesn't make sense to me. I think this direction of greater contact between Taiwan and China, developments in China, and a continuing American insistence that things be worked out peacefully can hold into the future. And so I think we ought to stick with the policy we have and adjust to the new circumstances.
You keep talking about the Chinese tourists. I'm talking about Chinese immigrant.
Oh, immigrants, not tourists.
No,
yeah,
no.
yeah. Okay, again, people immigrate because they think things would be better for them in the country they're immigrating to, right? And of course you have to vet your immigrants and so on. But if you can get good, productive, hardworking people to come into Taiwan and help increase the labor force from its currently very small area, then that ought to be a plus if handled right.
Okay, we're going to take a next question.
Okay.
All right, sir, there in the middle.
Admiral Blair, thank you for your comments today. Scott Harold, the Rand Corporation. You spoke very eloquently about the need to ground both the alliance and the bilateral relationship in a broader set of understandings amongst the American people about its importance. Today you're taking up the head of a major Japanese institution that tries to do outreach and help us all better frame the importance of this relationship. And I guess I'd like to, A, ask you to talk a little bit about the role of Track 2, people-to-people, cultural exchanges in kind of backstopping the high-level diplomacy, and B, ask you if you could just to unfold a little bit of your vision of how you're going to run the organization you're taking over and what role it'll play.
Right. Well, thanks, Scott. And I think the main thing is we need to have more people of your generation who understand about the U.S.-Japan relationship to sort of take the places of those of us who, of my generation, who have been working on it for a while. And let's face it, for a while there, in the 80s, when Japan was the monster that ate Hollywood, we all paid a lot of attention to Japan because it seemed like a threat, and we retooled our automobile factories, and we adapted to the challenge, and everybody was very aware of Japan and so on. And as that era went down, especially as Japan went into its era of economic stagnation, and China began busting, sort of when Americans thought Asia, they thought China, not Japan. So I think we need to direct our efforts to the younger generation, to more of the cultural and value affinities, really work the people-to-people organizations hard, and take advantage of those organizations and individuals who understand it, and ask them to widen their group. So I don't think there's a magic, wholesale policy that Sasakawa or anybody else can do. I think it's going to be very much a retail operation of working on the specific parts of the relationship that can do it. I think a lot of it has to be outside of Washington, not just here. We can have a meeting like this, and we probably have hit the 400 people who know the most about Japan of anybody in this town. But this is not the only place that we need to do it. We need to work in the St. Louis's and the Chicagos and the San Franciscos and the Houstons in order to spread the word. We need to look at what programs are out there and how we can get more out of them. So it's pretty much I think a retail operation, and I think Sasakawa can play both an individual role and a sort of a convening role in trying to make that happen.
Okay, I'm going to get over here. You, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeff Barron. I'm retired from the Foreign Service. In October of 2000, Secretary Albright was in Pyongyang kind of talking with the North Koreans about their missile program, and the plutonium program was frozen at Yongbyon. Can you imagine any circumstances in which US officials and North Korean officials in the future could have that kind of conversation again? Thanks very much.
Learning never to say never is more true in North Korean relations than it is in perhaps any other. And when I was director of national intelligence, having had some experience with North Korea, I'm I'm a proud owner of some of the most vile epithets that North Korean press can call anybody, and I take that as a badge of honor. But you know, I really pushed to see if we could understand this place more. And I think that there's a degree of unpredictability to it that is going to be hard to penetrate. So, in general, the idea of thinking that, but I think the foundation of North Korea is pretty well understood. It's a criminal, brutal dictatorship trying to keep a small family of people in power at the expense of the rest of the country. And if you ever forget that, I think you're going to make a big mistake. So the idea of visiting and exchanging emails and clinking glasses, I don't see anywhere in the future. I think the North Koreans basically understand power, and we need to make sure that they understand that certainly the sort of military provocations that they might be thinking about are going to be dangerous for them, and that's how we best. And then you let the system implode. I mean, a lot of us have been thinking that for a long time, and it hasn't happened yet. The family has kept its nerve. It's enslaved more of its people. It's been more brutal in its actions, and that'll go a long time. But eventually it's got to crack.
So I think we have time for at most one or two more questions. I want to try to get in the back there. You, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Admiral. My name is Dong Hui Yu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. It was reported by the New York Times that when President Obama traveled from South Korea to Malaysia last week, the Air Force One did submit the flight plan to China when it went through the ADIZ of the East China Sea. From your understanding, what does it mean?
I would say that's doesn't send a signal either way. I mean, China has an ADIZ, and countries, so does the United States, so does Japan. All countries have them. There are not rules that say that you have to negotiate your ADIZ. A narrow legal interpretation says that you set it up for your own purposes. But most countries are pretty careful and cooperative in the way that they set one up, especially if they're going to do it in a controversial area that's been an area of high tension. And China was not. They just slapped it out there and said, here it is. Now, China had been thinking about that for a long time. They've had plans to expand their ADIZ in many areas. They didn't like it the way it was. But I think it's sort of indicative of Chinese behavior. Was the way that they did it, rather than talking to people, hearing them out, and then making their own decision. They sort of we woke up one morning and there was this ADIZ. So I think it was handled badly by China. I think it gives other countries in the region and the United States the idea that China is not being a responsible member of the community in that region who's willing to consult widely before taking action that affect others. And so I think they could have done it a whole lot better. But whether Air Force One went through it or not, and whether they pre-notified or not, I have no idea.
All right, let's get another question. We have in the back, you, sir. Yeah.
Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. Admiral, thank you for your incisive comments. Given what you said about the North Korean regime, the nature of that regime and its performance over the decades, could you comment on China's role as an enabling partner for North Korea, whether it sees North Korea as a useful, quote, ally, unquote, and whether you see any way of China changing its policy toward North Korea?
The question of Chinese leverage on the North Koreans is I think, a pretty sophisticated one. It's not as simple as those who say, well, China supplies 40% of the cement and 30% of the coal. All China has to do is threaten to cut that supply, and North Korea will, have a free and fair election. I think the leverage that China has with North Korea is quite negative leverage, because if they have the conversation with the North Koreans that say, we're going to cut down our supplies to you and make life miserable for you, and the North Koreans say, okay, yeah, and then what? Then we have internal instability, the regime falls down, refugees go across your border, loose nukes. Is that what you want, China? It's just not. It's not something that. It's not something that has unlimited influence on North Korea. So I think that China is playing a restraining game, and it could restrain more, but I don't think it has decisive influence. In addition to which, I think China's made a pretty cold-blooded calculation that it prefers a cruel, despotic, undeveloped North Korea that at least is stable to taking a chance on a North Korea that might blow up if the economic situation became really dire, and if coups started, that would cause more trouble for China than the North Korea that they have, and they therefore are not ready to make a complete change of policy towards supporting a better regime for the people of North Korea. So I sort of think that's where they are. There are some, when I visit China and talk to people there are some Chinese who are beginning to feel differently about this and thinking that maybe the current Chinese policy is not in China's best long-term interest. I think that conversations between the United States and China and the Republic of Korea could come up with some pretty reassuring futures for the Korean Peninsula if there were a change of regime there, which would be in China's interest, in which there could be assurances that China's worst fears wouldn't be borne out. Republic of Korea with nuclear weapons and American forces on the Yalu border, which would sort of be a much worse situation if China that China can imagine. So I think through that dialogue, things could move in a better direction. But right now, I think that China fundamentally believes that it's better to keep that regime hobbling along, however bad it is. It poses less of a threat to them than it does falling apart.
Okay, we have time for one last question, I'm told, and you've been very patient, sir, here in the front. So.
Thanks. Roger Cliff of the Atlantic Council. I wanted to get back to the issue of Japan's new security policy and capabilities. And Admiral, you spoke in your prepared remarks about a lot of the legal and political restraints on the use of force in Japan, and not so much shortcomings in the capabilities. But the most recent National Defense Program guidelines said that Japan was going to at least study the possibility of acquiring offensive capabilities, and these are primarily directed against being able to preempt a North Korean missile attack on Japan. But I just wanted to hear your opinion on whether or not Japan acquiring offensive capabilities would be something desirable, particularly from the U.S. perspective.
I've learned that those words, offensive and defensive weapon systems, are pretty hard to pin down, and I tend to look more at overall systems and political decision and military decision-making process. So I would not be one who would oppose or favor a particular Japanese weapon system for one purpose or another. I would look more at the overall set of systems and Japanese capability. I mean, amphibious shipping is a classic example. Japan built a quite capable sort of mid-sized landing platform system, and that's what you use to deliver troops to invade a country. On the other hand, that was the platform that formed the foundation of this task force that we heard about that provided relief in the Philippines for those typhoon victims. So I wouldn't categorize systems. I'd look more at overall exercises, planning, and systems.
So I'm told we actually, if we can persuade you, we do have time. We're waiting for our next speaker that we can do one.
Well, we can talk until Shiba-san comes, if the audience can, or we can give them a break, either one.
You're the new head of the foundation, so you get to say.
I'd say break in 3 minutes.
All right, we'll get this question, and then we'll give you guys a break. Thank you so much, Admiral.
Thank you very much for hosting this forum. Andrew Osterman, State Department, White House, retired, thankfully. One of the enduring themes I've dealt with in 40 years between U.S.-Japan relations, military and security operations, has been the ongoing difficulty of integrating our information systems. It's very hard and increasingly difficult to share lots of information now when these systems are both antiquated and not interoperable. Can you identify who you feel should be taking the lead in this issue?
Who should be
taking the lead in the U.S. and Japanese governments in bringing together this information integration?
Are you thinking mostly military information systems?
No, we're talking about e-government, passports, visas, watch lists, the full range. Yeah. My philosophy on that stuff over the years is avoid big bang solutions. Don't sign a huge contract that is going to do it all for you, but rather look from a functional perspective and try to improve the individual component pieces of it, and then hire some smart integrators to put the GUIs across the top so that you can move information where it was. And I think, frankly, we need to resist a little bit everybody needs to know everything all the time, which has gotten us in quite a bit of trouble recently in my old intelligence world in particular. So I'm kind of an incrementalist, and put your money to the people who have a real job to do and let them spend it on improving things for them, but then have an overall authority that makes sure that they're not doing something that is completely hermetically sealed, that will require everybody else with whom they must deal to spend $1 bazillion just to get their information. So if I were king, I would have a pretty federated system on that.
Fascinating. Admiral, thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for all these terrific questions.
Good, yeah. Enjoyed it, Susan.
Thank you.